Hi there, I'm Joshua Hanlon, and today I'm at Japan's first UNESCO World Heritage Site, Himeji Castle. While some type of fortification has sat on this spot since the 14th century, the castle you see behind me today was not built until the early 17th century, at the beginning of the Edo period here in Japan. Now over the Edo period, over the centuries, it passed down through successive leaders and many peaceful transitions, because this site here, the castle site, was never actually part of any significant battle. At the end of the Edo period, as they transitioned into the Meiji Restoration in Japan, this castle was one of 56 chosen to be saved, as many other castles throughout the country were torn down. Once you got into the 20th century, during World War II, the Himeji Castle actually survived two separate large bombing campaigns that flattened most of Himeji City. The castle still miraculously survived. Following World War II, they went through several periods of restoration to make it look as beautiful as it is today. The most recent one ending in 2015, where they restored much of the outer white walls that you see when you first walk up to the castle. So now let's take a look at some of the design features that made Himeji Castle such a formidable fortress. Here you can see a great example of a couple of the main defensive structures that castles like Himeji Castle use to keep out invaders. One is this square moat called the Sengoku Bori Moat, and so bodies of water like this that ran around the castle and throughout the castle were excellent for keeping defenders away from the main keep area. You also see the slanted stone walls around here, and these walls improved over the years as Japanese fortification builders got better at stacking the walls in a way that maximized their fortification value, and they even learned to do like fan style sloping where it became very steep at the top and almost impossible for anyone to climb up. And so all of these fortifications combine to keep people away from the main keep that you see at the top of the hill there. So, fun fact, when you enter the main keep of Meiji Castle, you actually take your shoes off and then carry them around with you, because the inside, unlike what it looks like from the outside, is all wooden here. So you're walking around on all wooden floors, and the walls are all wooden on the inside. You also have these windows here that are thickly latticed to try to keep out bullets and enemy arrows. One of the features throughout Himeji Castle are these winding, narrow walkways to get from one level to another. And this was to create a situation where attackers were forced into narrow fire zones that forced them close together so that they could be easily killed by gunfire or by bow and arrow fire as they tried to make their way through the fortress. In the wall to my right here, you can see what are known as the samas, or the loopholes of the fortress. So there were four different types. Right here we have the oblong, which were used for bows and arrows, and you can see this is a bigger opening. The other three types were all used for guns. You had the triangle, and then the square over here, as well as a round hole. And so depending on which type of weapon you were using is which type of hole you would shoot out of. There are almost 1,000 of these throughout the fortress, so they were placed all throughout the walls to get as good defense as possible. Here's an excellent model that shows how the city around the castle was laid out. So you can see the very central part there in the castle is where the head of the domain lived. Then as you move out, you see the layer of walls around there is where the samurai would have lived. And as you zoom out and see the entire thing with this outer layer, that outer portion is where the merchants would have lived. And so depending on your social standing is how close you lived to the castle. Now I'm at Osaka Castle, not too far from Kyoto, to give you another example of some excellent Japanese castle architecture. You can see the very wide moat as well as the large sloped stone walls. And you can also see a great example of a smaller defensive tower here on the right. So these towers would have typically been 2 stories high and had lots of windows that you could fire bows or guns out of. They would have protected the main walls as well as provided flanking fire for the gates in case the enemy was trying to break through at the gates. Now we'll take a look at the history of castles in Japan and how they evolved over the centuries. As we've seen from Himeji Castle, they shared a lot of similarities as far as the purposes that they were built for to their other similar counterparts within Asia as well as castles in Europe. So while they shared similarities for why they were built, they did look very different. The two main purposes of the castles were for defense and for showing wealth and power of whoever the leader was that built the castle. And so you had kind of the real concrete purpose as far as defense, and that's what all those different designs inside are for with the loopholes and everything. But then they were certainly symbols of power as well, and showing how wealthy and powerful the local lord was and how much control he had over the surrounding land. There's a very long history of castles in Japan going back to the medieval times. Japanese castles were usually built in the mountains and were mountain fortresses kind of built exclusively for defense almost. During this period there was less of that showing wealth and power. But then this changed as the samurai multiplied and there became more and more people throughout Japan and they needed to rule more land. They kind of came out down from the mountains and were built on kind of higher hills overlooking areas like Himeji Castle here, which overlooks the surrounding area, or even down in the plains as well. And that way they were able to control more of the land around them. This became particularly true during the Sengoku period, or the period of warring states, which saw many castles built throughout Japan because you had a bunch of rulers vying for power all the time and constantly building castles in order to preserve their land. Towards the end of that period, you have the Battle of Sekigahara, one of the most famous and influential battles in Japanese history. This is when the period of warring states ended and Tokugawa Ieyasu started the Tokugawa shogunate, which ushered in the Edo period. Around this period is when you have both Himeji Castle and the Osaka Castle being built, and this was really the height of castle building in Japan as far as their power and their impressiveness is concerned. Right around 1600, this time period is when castles became the most impressive. Following the Battle of Sekigahara, there was a rule put in place of one castle per province, and so during the Edo period, you saw a lot of those old medieval fortresses that were up in the mountains being torn down, and then power consolidated around one large central castle in each province. Because of that, castles began to lose most of their military value. There was a long period of peace during the Edo period, so castles began to lose most of that purely defense value that they had during the medieval period and moved primarily into places of government rule over the surrounding lands. And so you can see that transition. The medieval period of pretty much just defense. Then during the warring states, it became kind of a mix of defense and rule. During Edo, it became basically just to rule over the surrounding areas. And you can see how that changed over the years. At the end of the Edo period in the 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, many castles were abandoned or destroyed as Japan modernized and tried to catch up with a lot of European countries in the Industrial Revolution. They didn't really care about the castles anymore. Their defense value was basically not worth anything, so a lot of them were abandoned or destroyed. Then as you get into the 20th and 21st centuries, you see periods of restoration and reconstruction booms that took place. And these were times when castles like Himeji Castle and many other castles throughout Japan were restored, and they had, for instance with Himeji, the white plaster was restored and made to look much better. The walls, the moats, everything like that, anything to do with the castles, the keeps were all restored and modernized to be safe for visitors to explore the castles and explore more of the history of Japan. If you're interested in visiting Himeji Castle yourself, it's 1,000 yen to enter, but for only 40 more yen than that, you can get a combination ticket for the castle and the Kokoen garden next door here. I'd highly recommend the combination ticket because this garden is an excellent example of a Japanese style garden, and it's really beautiful just to walk around and see all the plants, the trees, and the fish in the ponds. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy your trip to Japan.